Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. Tonight, we have guest Anthony Peake. This guy is just a bounty of knowledge. He's written over 8 books, and we're going to discuss his most recent work called The Immortal Mind. He's also the author of Is There Life After Death?, The Daemon, The Gnostic Four, A Life of Philip K. Dick, and The Out-of-Body Experience. Now, Anthony grew up outside of Liverpool, England, and was educated at Warwick University and the London School of Economics. He is also a member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Scientific Medical Network, and Society for Psychic Research. Anthony, it's a pleasure to have you on the show here with us at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
I'm really well. How are you then?
I'm doing very good. I've been following your work now for over 5 years. I know we talked a little bit before the show. I had a chance to speak with you several years ago, and we talked a lot about the holographic universe theory, the simulation possibilities, and it just seems like every time you come out with a new book, there's just a blockbuster amount of information that's cutting edge. So what I was hoping you could do real quick, because I know we've only got an hour here today, is give our audience just a real brief description about yourself and why you decided to start writing about the out-of-body experiences and mind being bigger than just the brain.
Sure. Unlike many people who write in this area, I'm not an experiencer. I have had occasional, what I would call time slips, I suppose, for want of a better term. I've also experienced precognitive deja vu sensations in the past. But I'm not somebody that's actually had anything that you would say was really incredibly strange. My interest has always been trying to understand these experiences, trying to explain why it is when somebody claims they've had an out-of-the-body experience that they sense that they're floating above their body. Is it neurological? Or what is the explanation for it? So my approach has always been do the science first, do the neurology first, do the quantum physics first, and then take it from there. And then if things make sense, then we have a potential answer to a lot of the mysteries of consciousness itself. And indeed, my main area of focus over the years has always been what exactly is consciousness? And when we say that we're perceiving an external world, what exactly is that external world? And to what extent can we know that that external world is real? And my latest work, particularly, I know you had Jim Elvidge on recently, and my approach is very, very similar to Jim in the idea of it being some form of hologram. And it is either a brain-generated hologram or consciousness is in a field all around us. My first book is There Life After Death, The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, very much based itself upon an explanation of the near-death experience. I then moved on to explaining Duality of Consciousness in my book, The Daemon. Then it was the out-of-body experience, where I approached the out-of-body experience as an issue. And you're probably around about 3 books behind, because The Immortal Mind was written a few years ago now with Professor Irvin Laszlo, which was an analysis of whether we can prove scientifically that consciousness is external to the brain. But I've also written a book called The Infinite Mindfield, which discusses the role of dimethyltryptamine in terms of consciousness, the pineal gland, how the pineal gland may actually modulate reality. And indeed, what I'd like to talk about today as well is my upcoming book, which is due out in the States and in the UK in September, which is called Opening the Doors of Perception, which is an updating of the 1954 Aldous Huxley book, The Doors of Perception. So that's a very quick run through my background and what bees are in my bonnet, as it were.
Oh, that's fantastic. And for those that have had an out-of-body experience, I actually had one several years ago, not intentional. I was falling asleep and I popped out of my body. It scared me so bad that I woke myself back up, and then I did it again. And then after that, I started to research it and study it and actually learn how to do it at a conscious level. I can't do it every time, but sometimes if I spend enough time and I'm sleepy enough, about ready to go to sleep, but I can keep my mind awake, I'm able to do that. But what does that actually mean? I mean, what is an out-of-body experience? Because it feels like you're actually leaving your body, but are you?
Well, this is one of the areas that's fascinated me for a long time. In my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, I very much was of the opinion that it's an external experience. You feel that you're outside of your body, whereas in fact, you've never actually left your brain. You've never left your consciousness. But what you're doing, you're in what's called a REM intrusion state, which is effectively when you think you are awake when in fact you're asleep. And you are existing within a brain-generated image of what you remember your bedroom to look like, or indeed your general environment. And you then move within that environment as if it's real. Now, there is another phenomenon that's allied to this called sleep paralysis. And again, sleep paralysis has been, it's been mentioned for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, there's a very famous painting by the Anglo-Swiss painter Henry Fuseli called Nightmare. And you probably know the picture. It's a lady lying on a bed with a creature sitting on her chest.
Oh, yeah.
And yep. And of course, the in-joke of the painting is that if you look into the corner of the room, there is a window, and there's a white horse poking its head through the door or through the window. And that's the nightmare. Now, what they're describing there is something that has been reported for centuries. You know, it is this thing whereby you feel that you cannot move. It feels like you're trapped inside your body, and you can't communicate. Now, neurologically, what seems to be happening here is that when we are asleep in a sleep state, there are certain neurotransmitters that are released in the brain that actually stops the body thrashing around. It's a way of protecting us from damaging ourselves, because there is an instinct when you're dreaming to reenact what's happening in your dream in reality. So effectively, if you feel that you're fighting off a monster or something, you're going to thrash out with your arms and with your legs. And you could damage yourself, or you could damage somebody sleeping with you. So what tends to happen is the body releases a chemical which effectively stops you moving. Now, if you happen to become semi-conscious in this state, you will feel like you can't move, because literally you can't. And you will have a sensation of being pressed down by something. Now, this, of course, is the old idea of the incubus and the succubus as well. It's the idea that something is pressing on you. Now, when you're in this state as well, there is something called a hag phenomenon. And this is where you will see in the room or somewhere around you a hooded, cowled figure. Now, again, it's regularly reported. And indeed, this has been reproduced experimentally by a guy called Michael Persinger at the Laurentian University in Sudbury in Canada, where he has been stimulating the brain using ultrasound. And in doing so, he can bring about these experiences of what he calls the sensed presence. Now, that explains a certain amount, but it doesn't explain the out-of-body experience, the sensation of floating above the body. Now, I still believe that when you go into these out-of-body states, you are in a form of dream, but it doesn't mean it's not real, if that makes sense. In other words, I call it the intrasomatic experience, in the sense that you are you're not outside of your body, but you are still experiencing another reality that is not this one. The reason I say this is that there is very rare examples of individuals who can bring back information when they've been in the out-of-the-body experience state. There are people who claim they do, and over the years there are people who claim they can distance view, there are people who claim they can astral travel. But my research has shown that there's very little proof that anybody has really been able to get outside of their body, see something and bring that information back. So again, if there's anybody out there who has experienced these kind of things, I'm very keen to hear from them. Now, the corollary of this story is that when I wrote my first book, one of the people that contacted me was a guy called Nichols, who is, he trains people in out-of-the-body experiences.
Yeah, great guy. We had him on the other day.
Oh, he's wonderful. So you'll know about Graham's experience in London in 1999, which he probably discussed, I guess.
Oh, I think he did. It was a while ago when he had him on, but he said that he's actually had personal experiences, and then he started I think it's called the Discovery Program after that.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Graham and I worked together quite closely. We did a training. He and I were trainers on a course recently. I have a lot of respect for Graham. And what Graham has shown to me is that he has evidence that he has been out of his body and he has experienced something that subsequently was proven to be true. Again, I'll go into slight detail about this because it still amazes me. Graham was training people when he suddenly felt very, very strange, felt his knees buckle. The next thing, he was somewhere else. And that somewhere else was a kind of a jungle scenario. He starts walking through the jungle. He's feeling the heat. He's really there. So he's out of his body. And he parts the plants and the vines around him. And he steps out and he's standing on a corner in the West End of London, in Soho. As he explained to me, he said that the situation was totally real. And he looked down Old Compton Street, I think it was. And as he looked down the street, he sees an explosion take place in a pub halfway down the road. As he hears this, he hears voices in the background, and it's people in the lecture theatre trying to call him back. So he finds himself then coming to, and he announces to the group around him that he has precognized there's going to be a terrorist attack in London soon. 5 days later, there was a terrorist attack in exactly, and I mean exactly, the place that Graham said and saw in his out-of-body hypnagogic state. Now, to me, this was more than an out-of-the-body experience. This was a precognitive out-of-the-body experience, which suggests to me yet again that whenever you're in these out-of-body experiences, you're in this kind of liminal world that is both part of this world and not. Now, there is no argument about Graham's experience. You cannot argue against it because there were witnesses. The witnesses witnessed the fact that Graham announced that there was going to be a terrorist attack and where it was going to be. The only argument you can come down to is all the witnesses colluded with Graham, or Graham is a liar. And I don't believe any of those, because Graham, when Graham and I have done interviews, and we've done quite a few interviews together now, is that Graham cannot spontaneously get himself out of his body. He has techniques whereby you can facilitate getting outside of your body. Therefore, I don't believe that there is anybody out there, I may be corrected that I'm wrong, people who claim that they can automatically get themselves out of their body and move around in consensual reality. That is the reality that we all share. So this concept is far more complex and far more interesting because I tie it in with dimethyltryptamine, I tie it in with shamanic traveling, lucid dreaming, all these things. And they are neurologically based. There's no doubt they are neurologically based. But my argument is that they are not hallucinations, or indeed they are hallucinations, but the definition of hallucination should be changed. Because the argument is, so I've had an hallucination. What's the definition of hallucination? It is something that you perceive that is not given to you by your senses. If you share an hallucination with somebody else, another person, it's a folie à deux, where both of you seem to share an hallucination. Now, materialist reductionist science uses this as an explanation. But of course, it's not an explanation at all. It suggests telepathy. It suggests that two people can both experience the same thing at a distance, which is impossible by any criteria of modern science, with the exception of probably the arguments of superposition or entanglement. This cannot happen. If there's a group of people who collectively see something, it's called a collective delusion. But that science is just saying it is an hallucination. But if you start looking at what we mean by hallucinations, you'll find that they don't know. Neurologists don't know what an hallucination is. It's a label they use. And I believe it's because hallucinations are real, and what they're doing is they're opening the doors of perception for us to experience alternate forms of reality. I argue in my next book, The Opening the Doors of Perception, that consciousness, the brain restricts consciousness. The brain is a reducing valve that takes out a massive percentage of the reality that's out there, because we could not function if we took in all the information that was available to us. And I argue that under certain circumstances, certain individuals can open the doors of perception. They can either do it through temporal lobe epilepsy, through migraine, through Alzheimer's disease, through autism, Asperger's syndrome, various other things. And all these things open up the doors for us in one way or another.
Well, it's interesting because I've heard the study that we only see approximately 0.01% of the electromagnetic light spectrum, and then our brain filters out another 50% of that. So I do like that theory of the brain actually being a filtering mechanism, not something that will amplify your abilities, but can actually bring them down. So consciousness is such an amazing thing. Some people think that consciousness is spirit. Some people don't know what to think. What is your scientific evidence that points to consciousness being something outside of the physical brain matter?
Oh, sorry, I'm back there again.
Okay,
yeah,
good deal.
I put you on mute when you're talking because this is a very highly sensitive mic that I use.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd just like to touch upon one or two of the things you mentioned there. The actual concept of the brain as an attenuator, the brain as a reducing valve, is not original to me. I would not even vaguely try to claim it. Aldous Huxley was the guy that used the argument of the brain as a reducing valve, and even Huxley was influenced massively by a French philosopher by the name of Henri Bergson. And it was Bergson that first came up with the idea of the brain taking things out. Now, in terms of your idea of us seeing a small percentage of the electromagnetic spectrum, in my book, The Infinite Minefield, I spent a lot of time trying to find the perfect analogy for this. And the analogy I use is the Mississippi River. And as you know, the Mississippi River rises somewhere in northern Minnesota, and it travels right through the states till it actually leaves to the junction in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
Now, I can't even begin to know the distance of exactly that can be, because by mathematics, you can never actually tell the length of a river because it's how you measure it. It's just almost impossible. But effectively, if you argue that that is the electromagnetic spectrum from the incredibly high energy particles to the very, very long wave particles, the very, very long waves of electromagnetic energy, the photons and everything else, if you considered that to be the Mississippi River, human perception would be around about 1.5 inches, around about 18 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. Okay? So that is how small a window we have on reality. And funnily enough, I'm writing another article at the moment for a UK magazine, and I'm going to then extrapolate from that to say the hearing is the same. You know, there's a very small part of sound waves that we pick up. We don't pick up ultrasound and everything else. So there's so many things we don't perceive. Now, the idea that the brain creates consciousness doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense on so many different levels. There is something called the binding problem, which is known by neurologists and it's known by consciousness studies individuals. And this is whereby everything you perceive is perceived simultaneously, as if there is a place in the brain where it all comes together, as if there's a little homunculus in your head, a little man in your head that is sitting in a little room listening. He's got kind of speakers next to him and he's got kind of a camera in front of him and he sees the world. Now, firstly, that is a wrong assumption because it's an infinite regress, because the little man himself would need to have a little man in his head, etc., etc. But on top of this, there is no place in the brain that neurologists have ever found where everything comes together. Because, and it's a simple point, that different signals come in different speeds from different parts of the body. And for them all to come together in one place to give you the sense of simultaneity isn't possible. So this is called a binding problem. Now, back in 1998, 1997, 98, at the University of Arizona, there was a big conference, consciousness studies conference. And at that conference, a young Australian philosopher by the name of David Chalmers stood up and said, there are two massive problems facing science at the moment. The first one is the soft problem of consciousness, which is how the brain works. But we can do this. You know, if we take apart an engine or say a motorbike, we take a motorbike apart, we will know by taking the bits apart and analyzing the bits, we will know what a motorbike does. We'll know that it's how it works and what it does. This is materialist reductionism. It's modern science and it works very, very well. You take things apart to understand what makes them click, what makes them work. Consciousness cannot be explained in that way. It's like taking apart the motorbike to discover speed. In other words, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain behaviors. In other words, it's something that spontaneously happens at some point in the brain. Now, in my new book, I argue to say, okay, if consciousness is created by the brain, at what point does non-physical consciousness occur? Now, we have to take into account that consciousness is not a physical thing. It hasn't got weight, it hasn't got mass. It's something, it is a feeling, it is a qualia. The sense of being you. Yeah, go on.
I was just going to ask, because I've read a lot of studies about how when somebody dies, they lose automatically like approximately an ounce of weight or something like that. You're smiling. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's one of these kind of little myths that goes round and round. The idea, there was a series of experiments done around about 100 years ago where somebody weighed somebody before and after they died. Now, this is a contradiction in terms. It doesn't prove anything to spirituality, because if consciousness is non-physical, it shouldn't weigh anything. So there's a book written by a lady called Mary Roach that focuses in on this particular experiment, and there are issues with it. You know, I find that very hard to accept that consciousness has any kind of physicality to it, because it self-evidently hasn't. Okay, but we can come back to that for now. But just to continue on now about the idea of consciousness just appearing. If consciousness just appears, it must be because when the brain develops, or developed in the past, there must have been an addition of one molecule, one electron, and suddenly the brain went from being non-conscious to being consciously aware. And that's a huge leap. It's a massive leap. It's not the same as if, you know, most things in science are iterative. You mix things together and you get other things, but you can back create where the things came from. You can't do this with consciousness. Consciousness just spontaneously happens. Now, some materialist reductionists will argue that it's similar to how water gets wetness. You know, the idea that it is something that just occurs, but they're not even at first base to know how this occurs. The solution is, as far as I'm concerned, is that consciousness is prime. The consciousness is what creates everything. And we are embodied within something where we have the illusion of physicality. And I say we have the illusion of physicality because this is how perception works. We never ever interface with the external world. You may think at the moment that you're actually sitting in a chair and you can feel the chair on your backside, but you're not. You're not actually touching. You never touch anything. You're feeling the fields around the chair. And the reason for this is quite simple, because reality is 99.999% empty space. There isn't anything there. You take apart the atoms and you go into the atom, and you have the nucleus and you have the electrons. It's vastly empty space. But the empty space itself is not empty. It's a plenum. It's full of something called 0-point energy. 0-point energy is a form of energy that we really don't understand. But effectively, if you take things down to the point of just below absolute zero, I think it's just above absolute by about 1 or 2 degrees, there should be no energy there. But they've discovered that there is. There's something I think called helium-3, I think is one of these gases they can take down. It takes energy from somewhere where energy shouldn't be. And the only place they think that the energy is coming from is from the quantum vacuum, the actual empty space. There's energy within the empty space. Now, this energy, I think, is where consciousness comes from. It could explain dark energy. You know, dark energy is a huge mystery, as is dark matter. They call it dark matter not because it's dark, it's because they haven't got a bloody clue what it is. They just know it's there. So we have this hidden reality, and consciousness has that same thing, that same non-physicality about it. And each human being on the planet knows that they're conscious. But there are a group of scientists out there called eliminative materialists, people like Daniel Dennett, who argue, till the cows come home, they argue that consciousness is an illusion, that we are fooling ourselves into thinking we are conscious. Now, to me, how can that be? How can something that is non-sentient be fooled by anything? It's a contradiction in terms. It is so utterly ridiculous, it beggars belief. And of course, every single person listening to me talking now will know that they have an inner life, they have hopes, they have dreams, they have everything else. And to be told that you're just a figment of your own imagination is a huge insult. And the reason they do this is because consciousness cannot be explained by the materialist reductionist paradigm. They therefore pretend it doesn't exist. That is bad science. If something exists, we need to research it. That it doesn't fit in with our own worldview, so what? There were incidents back 100, 130, 120 odd years ago in the 1890s where there were certain things that science couldn't explain then. The various things such as the ultraviolet catastrophe, black body radiation, the issue of the photoelectric effect. These were all things that really could not be explained by 19th century science. However, a few years before, Michelson, the American physicist, had stood up at an opening of, I think it was one of the laboratories at the University of Chicago, and said, in all honesty, he actually said this, that he believed that science was so precise in its knowledge of things that all that was left would be to be defining things to, I think, a number of percentage points. Everything else was understood and it was measured. Indeed, a young man called Max Planck didn't know whether to become a musician or a physicist, and he was told by his professor that what he needed to do was to think about going into music, because physics, everything can be discovered about physics. Fortunately, Max Planck didn't do that and got a job as a physicist, did his PhD and did postdoc and everything else. And at the turn of the century, he was working with German companies to find ways of making light more effective, light bulbs, because the Germans felt they were being left behind by the British and the Americans in terms of illumination. So his job was to try and work with electromagnetic energy. To cut a long story short, there were certain things he discovered, and the only way he could explain them was to say that energy came in quanta, little packages. And in 1901, in December 1901, at Berlin, he did a presentation where he suggested that energy came in bits. This was a stunning announcement, and from that came quantum physics. 1905, Einstein comes along and explains the photoelectric effect. But these were individuals who were brave enough to realize that science could not explain everything and looked at things in toto. And because they did that, science then moved on to the next paradigm. We are at a similar position now. You know, physicists, brave physicists, are actually realizing that what we know from quantum physics, the issues we know about, and I mean real quantum physics here, I'm not talking about new age woo-woo quantum physics, I'm talking about the real deal. I'm talking about the quantum physics that's written by the serious scientists. They know that there's something inherently wrong with the understanding of the universe. For instance, The maths, if you plug in the equations that we use for relativity, that is the things that design the really big things in the universe, and you plug those into quantum physics, it doesn't work. And yet they're all part of the same reality. So we have two separate parts of reality that don't work with each other. The maths does not work. And you'll get quantum physicists getting nervous about this because these are the things they don't want to talk about. They want surety. They want to know that they are the experts in their field. It's only the brave ones, it's the Max Tegmarks of this world that are coming up and saying, we don't have all the answers. Stephen Hawking, some of the work Stephen Hawking is doing now in terms of black holes and Hawking radiation, this is revolutionary stuff. And it's in fact through the work of Hawking that we're now working on the idea that the universe itself is a huge hologram.
I've certainly heard of the holographic universe theory, and that's one thing I've been fascinated with ever since I read the book by Michael Talbot that came out, I think, in the late 90s. I mean, that guy was certainly ahead of his time. It's sad how he passed away just a couple of years after he came out with that work. And I just really like the possibilities that we have as human beings. I mean, it just seems as if we are kind of co-creators of this reality that we're in. You can go back to that experiment where just your perception on an object underneath a microscope will decide what it is, essentially. I mean, I got that right, didn't I, for the most part?
Yeah, what you're talking about here is the observer effect.
Yeah.
And it's the idea that subatomic particles effectively come into existence on the act of observation or the act of measurement. In other words, a subatomic particle exists in a probability wave. It's a wave of potential probabilities that it could be located somewhere. Say, for instance, you have a box, and inside that box is an electron, but that electron has not been observed or measured. Effectively, it could be anywhere in the box, and it potentially is anywhere in the box. It is everywhere in the box until the box is opened and it collapses into a point particle to accommodate the observation or the measurement of somebody. Now, this is called the observation effect. It's again something that scientists get very, very concerned about because they think people misinterpret it. They think that the act of measurement is not the same as the act of conscious awareness and consciousness experiencing something. But there is only measurement by observation. Effectively, something is not observed. If it's attached to a measuring device and nobody's looking at that measuring device, there's no measurement taking place. Because there isn't. The measurement takes place when a sentient being acknowledges the fact that the measurement is taking place. Now, of course, this clearly caused a degree of concern for a lot of individuals. Einstein never liked it. It's all to do with the Copenhagen interpretation, which was effectively brought together in the 1920s by Max Born and Niels Bohr and the guys based at Copenhagen University. Now, it was Born, I think, that came up with the idea of the statistics that the wave subatomic particles exist in waves. And the reason it came down to this is light, because light, when it is observed, is a particle. It's a photon. It's a little point particle. But when it is not observed, it's a wave. And the twin slit experiment has shown conclusively that if light is not being looked at and not being measured, it is a wave. But the minute that you put a measuring device somewhere, the wave function collapses to be a point particle. Now, everything we have found now that it's not just light waves, it's electrons, it's atoms, it's molecules. There's a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna. And again, look up Zeilinger's work because it is earth-shattering. He has been working with large molecules. And these large molecules, like buckyballs, a buckyball has 60 atoms in it. A buckyball is a non-physical nothing. It's a probability wave until it is measured and it becomes an object. This means, in effect, that anything that is not measured or is not perceived doesn't exist. This is why Einstein made his famous statement, "I do not believe that the moon is not there if I don't look at it." That was specifically what he was saying. Now, Einstein came up with something called the EPR paradox to the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen thought experiment to try and show that this idea of consciousness collapsing the wave function is nonsense and ridiculous. The interesting thing is, in 1980-81, a series of experiments were done at the University of Paris Institute of Optics under the work of a guy called Alain Aspect, I think it's pronounced Aspect, and they proved something called Bell's inequality. And Bell's inequality is the mathematical structure proving Einstein wrong. And they proved it scientifically in an empirical experiment. Now, since then, people like Zeilinger, the really interesting physicists, have been going out there doing some amazing things with subatomic particles. But most people are completely unaware of this. And they're unaware of it not because there is any conspiracy by science, it's just that science doesn't like to announce it. I do surveys when I do my talks, and I ask people, has anybody heard of the Alain-Aspect experiment? I very, very rarely find anybody who's ever heard of it. And it is because science is taught, even at undergraduate level, it is still taught for the science of 120 years ago, because simply it does not work anymore. It seems to work in the sense that we can do incredible things now with subatomic particles, but effectively we still don't understand why. But then again, we don't understand why electricity works. We don't understand why gravity works. You know, that nobody knows why it is that objects are drawn towards each other. We know that Einstein said that it's the bending of space-time, but that doesn't necessarily work either, because you still have to have some kind of attractive force coming about. You know, they use the example of space-time where they'll say, imagine that space is like an elastic sheet, elastic sheet, and it's taut, and you drop a heavy object in it, and the heavy object drags the sheet down, and smaller objects on the sheet will go round them because of the divot, the way in which it causes a divot in the sheet. But the reason that an example works is because there's supposedly gravity underneath the sheet. But in the reality, in space-time, there is no gravity underneath the sheet to make the analogy work, if that makes sense.
Well, and I find it fascinating with the different possibilities also of what CERN is doing right now. I mean, are they finding different particles? What do you think CERN is for? I mean, are they weaponizing black holes? What's going on there?
I'm not a conspiracy buff. I'm not interested in conspiracy. I think there's an awful lot of weird people out there with some very, very strange ideas about what is going on.
And I don't mean in a conspiracy in any way, shape, or form. I just don't know what they're doing out there.
Well, I think they're doing what they say they're doing. They were trying to find and discover, and subsequently discovered, the Higgs boson. And the Higgs boson bosons are objects that carry force. So, for instance, a photon is the force carrier of light, and it's called a boson. So all the things that carry the force of these are force carriers. But the issue is, what carries mass? How does mass come about? Why do things have mass? And they concluded, Peter Higgs came to the conclusion there must be a boson for mass, and they call this the Higgs boson. So by discovering that, they then have another piece of the jigsaw puzzle about how the universe works. And they can only do this by actually using very, very powerful machines that can actually smash particles together, because it's only by smashing particles together that you get other particles come spinning out. And this is effectively what it's doing. Now, clearly, there could be a scenario where they could create many black holes. And in fact, Stephen Hawking has argued that there are many black holes. Indeed, the whole holographic idea of the holographic nature of the universe, which Irvin Laszlo and I discuss in our book, The Immortal Mind, in the scientific section, is that space itself, the actual edge of space-time, is peppered with tiny, tiny, minute Planck-length black holes. Now, the Planck length is the smallest possible bit of anything you can have, the smallest part of space-time. It's incredibly minute. And they believe that these things are actually projecting into space information, digital information. And that information creates this. In other words, there is a 3D holograms creating a 2D hologram that we exist within. And we are within this. Now, again, news on this, if my critics are out there saying this is nonsense, it's not scientific nonsense, all I'd suggest they do is read any edition of Scientific American on this, particularly one that came out about 6 or 7 years ago, which had on the front of Scientific American, it said, "Is the universe a hologram?" So this is serious scientific work. This is not nonsense. This is not weird, wacko stuff. It's something that serious scientists are taking quite seriously. In fact, there's a guy called Vlatko Vedrell who was, I think, I'm not sure where he is now, but he was professor of physics at the University of Singapore. And Vedrell has written a book, whose name escapes me at the moment, which is about the universe is made of information. The only thing that actually exists is information. Everything else is created from information. And information is non-physical. It's working on somebody, if anybody's technical out there and is interested, it's the work of Claude Shannon and the idea of how digital information works. Now, if everything is digital, it means that we are in a digital universe. And if we're in a digital universe, we are in a hologram. We are in a simulation. This is a simulation. The question is, who is creating the simulation and why?
Well, yeah, those are the $2 million questions right there. I mean, you could go all the way back to some of the natives and the Aborigines talked about us being in this simulation thousands of years ago. So what have you found out? I know you put together that book called The Daemon. And for those that might not be aware of what daemon actually means, that's a Greek word, isn't it? For more of like a guardian angel, not necessarily demon, like what some people look at today. If they were to see that, they might just automatically reference the word demon because they're so similar.
Yeah, the daemon is the part of you that is outside of the simulation. It's from Greek, and the Greeks believed that we all had two elements to our personality, the daemon and the eidolon. The eidolon, the background to the word eidolon is from idol. So it is something that is fabricated, something that is made. And it's a representation of something else. Now, I argue that eidolons are embodied. You and I are both eidolons. We are perceiving this reality within time, within linear time. And we believe we are inside something that is real. The daemon is your game player. I use this analogy of if you've played any form of games, computer games, RPG games, first-person shooter, whatever. I use the example, because of my age, I use the example of Tomb Raider and Lara Croft. When you start the game with Lara Croft, you switch the game on, and Lara is in the screen. You're looking at Lara, and you're looking at her from a position outside of her body, looking down at her. You can make Lara move, but at the start of the game, you don't know any of the dangers out there at all. So you make Lara walk down the corridor, and she goes into a room, and she gets eaten by a monster. Lara is dead. You're not. You go back to the start of the game and you resurrect Lara again as another eidolon who has no memory of what she did before. And you move Lara down, and this time you don't make her go into the room with the monster. So Lara suddenly just has this feeling that she shouldn't go into the room. Imagine that Lara is sentient in some way. The sprite on the screen is sentient. She just realizes that something makes her not go into that room. She has a feeling. So she doesn't go into that room. And she goes further along and she gets killed again. And she goes back to the start of the game. I believe this is what life is like. It's my concept of cheating the ferryman. I argue that we all have a daemon, which is a being that exists outside of space-time or outside of our parameters of space-time, probably in the fifth or sixth dimension. Again, if anybody's seen the movie Interstellar, there is the section called the Tesseract section, whereby the central character looks from outside of space-time into the life of his daughter. And he sees it in kind of reflecting images and everything else, and things embroiled within themselves. This is how I believe reality is. And I think many of the movies now are working on zeitgeist, they're working on the Weltgeist. These are things that people instinctively know are true. So effectively, your daemon has lived your life many times within the simulation. Like Groundhog Day, where the central character Connor lives the same day over and over again, I believe we live the same life over and over again as eidolons. And each time we play the game, we get it slightly better. Our daemon remembers what happened last time and helps us through. But of course, there will be points where the daemon has no more knowledge of what's about to happen next than the eidolon does, because it's where the daemon last got to in the point in the game. I argue this is the explanation for deja vu. People have deja vu sensations. 70% of people around the world at some stage in their life will have a deja vu sensation. It's inexplicable. And if anybody turns around to me and says, oh, people out there will be going, oh, it is explicable. It's explicable. It's your eye sees something a split second before the other eye does. That is complete rubbish. Or as we'd say in the UK, bollocks. Can I say that on there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Good. Okay. So that's complete bollocks. And the reason it's complete bollocks is that you'll read it in most psychology books. Even today, you will read the explanation of deja vu is something called the visual pathways. It's put forward by 1961 by a guy called Robert Efron. A few years ago, a guy called Akira O'Connor at the University of Leeds over here in the UK, working with a guy called Chris Moulon, discovered that people who are born blind get hearing deja sensations, whereby they hear something twice. Now, effectively, that is impossible with the visual pathways. The visual pathways in the brain work completely differently to the hearing pathways, which means that that explanation is dead in the water. Other people will turn around and say it's an explanation of reincarnation. A moment's reflection will tell you that's utter nonsense as well. If you are sitting in your studio now, or your office or whatever, and you suddenly have a deja vu sensation, you're not dressed as somebody else. You're not sometime in the past. You are sitting as you in your studio wearing 21st century clothes, sitting in front of a computer screen. That cannot be a deja vu sensation from a past life, because in past lives, people didn't stand in front of computer machines like this. So effectively, it is your life you are remembering. And indeed, Vernon Neppe, who is one of the world's leading authorities on the deja vu sensation, a guy who lives in Seattle, his definition is, and I never quite get this right, but it's something to do with the fact that it is a memory that you're not quite sure where you remembered it from, but it's sometime at an undisclosed part of your past. Now, an associate of mine, Dr. Art Funkhauser, suggests that it's a dream. You've had a precognitive dream recently, and the deja vu is your dream coming true in three-dimensional reality. Whatever it is, it proves it's precognitive. I know people who have precognitive deja vu sensations, where they know what's going to happen for the next couple of seconds. Most of these people have either got migraine, or they've got temporal lobe epilepsy, or they experience migraine, and classic temporal lobe epilepsy. This is because the doors of perception, they're starting to appreciate, their brain is starting to leak over information from the Daemon, from the demonic consciousness, which is the consciousness outside of time. And this is why people have deja vu sensations. You've lived this life before. If you have a deja vu sensation, you're in a simulation and you're living your life before. Now, go on, yeah.
So people that have deja vu experiences often, or maybe somebody notices that there's a week that goes by and they're experiencing that deja vu tremendously multiple times a day, what would you recommend they do?
Well, I would suggest that if that is happening, you as an eidolon are starting to remember something, and it's building up to something, because most deja vu sensations, most deja veku, actually already lived sensations, are normally very mundane. This is the whole mystery of deja vu as to why it's not significant. It's just a recognition of something that's very normal. But if it starts to be nested, there's something building up somewhere in your life. There's something that's going to happen. Rather like I suppose the analogy is you watch a movie and you've forgotten you've seen the movie before, and you start to watch sequences in the movie and you think, I've seen this before. And what you'll find is when there's been something really traumatic happen in the movie, your level of recognition will start to increase. And you'll start to have this feeling of dread or nervousness. Now, again, this can be applied. There was a series of experiments done by Dean Radin and Dick Bierman in 1999. And what they did was they measured the conductance of the skin. Because when we are nervous, or we're ill at ease, or we're feeling dread, the skin reacts. The actual conductancy of the skin changes. Now, they did a series of experiments whereby they showed people a series of photographs of fluffy kittens and nice things. And they interspersed with these photographs horrible pictures of car crashes and disasters and everything else. People's skin would react, which means mentally they were reacting before they saw the horrible sequence, which suggests that we can monitor the immediate future. Now, to be reasonable about this, there is also something called the gambler's fallacy, which is a reasonable criticism of this experiment, and it's a simple one. If you're a gambler and you're gambling on red or black, when you're sort of playing what is it, with the thing that goes round?
Roulette?
Roulette, that's it.
Yeah.
And you're betting on black or red. If you're betting on red, and more black comes up, if the first one comes up black and then black again and black again, instinct tells us that every time that black comes up, the chance of red coming up is higher next time round. But that is statistically wrong, because each time it's spun, it's still 50-50. Okay? Now, there is an argument to say that these individuals were suffering from something similar, in that they hadn't seen a horrible picture for quite some time. So every time a nice kitten appears on the photographs, they feel that the chances are the next one will be a horrible one. So they build up the tension, and that reacts within the conductancy of the skin. So there is a counter-argument to say that. But I argue that there's other evidence from this. There's something called the Phi phenomenon. There is something called the cutaneous rabbit experiment. There's something called the Libet experiment in tension to flex. These are all known psychological experiments, all of which show that we in some way can monitor our immediate future. If we are not monitoring our immediate future, the only other answer is that we buffer information before it's presented to consciousness. And if we buffer information before it's presented to consciousness, it means we're recording our experiences, which then could explain the idea of my life flash before my eyes as far as part of the NDE phenomenon. So that's why many scientists don't like me, because they'll put up explanations for things, and I will point out that that explanation actually proves something else that doesn't make any sense. So either we have the situation whereby we can perceive the immediate contents of our future, which is the idea, first explanation for these effects, or the brain buffers everything like a computer does and waits, sometimes up to 6 seconds. There's a guy called Dylan Haynes in Germany that's been doing experiments on this for years. And Dylan Haynes argues that up to 6 to 8 seconds, the brain has already made a decision to take actions before we have decided to do it, which means it knows in advance what's going to happen. So neurology is telling us some phenomenal things. And these things are all pointing in one direction. This is a simulation that part of us has already experienced.
And with that said, what do you think is the most important thing to obtain in this reality? Do you feel that evolution, kind of like Jim says, is something that has to take place? Free will has to exist in order for evolution to happen. Therefore, this isn't all predestined, and this isn't something that we have to go follow exact steps. We have the chance to think for ourselves.
This is what you do here. You bring in either Everett's many worlds interpretation, the many minds interpretation, or the recent iterations of Everett's 1957 breakthrough in terms of the many worlds interpretation, which is effectively that everything that can happen is already encoded within the 0 point field. So therefore, every decision you make, you collapse the wave function of that outcome. So in which case you have free will, even though everything is already pre-decided, if that makes sense. In other words, rather like you can make free decisions when you're playing a first-person computer game, so it is you can make free will decisions within the game that we play, which is reality. So by doing so, it means that you live your life over and over again. You can live it thousands of times. And in those thousands of times, you will eventually live the perfect life. You will do whatever it is that you are supposed to create the outcomes or whatever it is. Now, I argue that all this happens in the split second before you die. And again, in my first book, as you know from our previous interview, this is what I suggest, that the past life review is all evidence of the fact that we go into a groundhog life in the final sessions of our life. And again, if people want to criticize me here, I do the neurology of this. I'm not just making this up. If somebody wants to talk to me about the neurotransmitters involved, if somebody wants to point out to me that what neurotransmitters are they, I'll tell them it's glutamate. It's glutamate, and it is also probably endogenously generated dimethyltryptamine, which is synthesized in the pineal gland. And effectively, this is our modulator of reality. In other words, we have things within the simulation that modulate the reality around us, and certain neurotransmitters and certain neurochemicals in the brain bring this about. So we then live the life over and over again. Now, the ancient, the Buddhists, particularly the Buddhists of the Bon tradition and the Buddhists of Tibet and the Tibetan plateau, have a concept called the bardo state. The bardo state is that state between life and death. And in that state, you experience huge things. Again, this is ancient wisdom. This is something that has been known for centuries, and I'm trying to do the science of it. The bardo state is effectively what I call my cheating the ferryman hypothesis. And I argue that what we're existing in is something I call the Bohmian IMAX. The Bohmian IMAX is in deference to the great American physicist called David Bohm. David Bohm came up with an idea, something called the implicate and explicate orders. Again, it's to do with holography and it's to do with holograms. Bohm argued that, again, everything here is a hologram. It's a simulation. So in which case you live the perfect life, and just like Connors in the movie Groundhog Day, you move on to the next life, to the next iteration, to the next level of reality. But it all happens, all these thousands of lives happen in the split second before you die. And this is the important point. You do not die. You die in the phanerons, in the worldview of the people that watch you die, but you don't, because you fall out of time. So I'm not arguing here this is life after death. It's far more complex than that. It's far more elegant than that. I don't need to prove that there's life after death, because it's time that is the issue here. It's time that changes. Time is subjective. You can experience a whole lifetime in a split second. We all know this. We know how time slows down when you're in an accident. Time slows down when people have near-death experiences. Time slows down during dimethyltryptamine experiences, ketamine experiences, LSD experiences, ibogaine experiences. All these things, time slows down.
You know, it's certainly great to have you on the show with us, Anthony. You're an encyclopedia of knowledge, and I certainly like your approach being scientific, not woo-woo. I always enjoy a good woo-woo story here at the Leak Project, but it's also nice to get some data points and solid scientific information. So I think that that's what it's going to take to get people to the next level if they're stuck within certain paradigms.
I think here, just very quickly, I think here the danger is you go woo-woo, the materialist reductionists and the skeptics will crucify you. They will absolutely crucify you. You will be made to look a complete and utter idiot if you go down the woo-woo route. That's why I'm not liked. They won't engage with me. They won't engage with me because they can deal with the woo-woo merchants. They can deal with the guys that lost their reputations over 2012. You know, jump on a bandwagon, you're going to get burned. Make predictions, you're going to get burned. Do the science. They can't argue with you because they can't.
Well, you're right, and if they do argue with you, it's just trolling. It's senseless information. They'll just do all caps and a couple exclamation points calling you bad names, and then you know they're just stupid idiots anyway because they don't read the material. They're ignorant to the subject. So this is awesome, Anthony. I've always enjoyed talking with you. I love your work, and I would like to recommend our listeners go to anthonypeake.com. You'll have access to his books there, a lot of information. Also, you're on Amazon too, aren't you?
Sorry, just to stress, I'm not a self-published author. You don't need to just go on Amazon to get my books. You can go into your bookshop in Little Rock, Arkansas and order my books. They might even have my books there. You know, my books are published in the USA. My next book will be published simultaneously in North America and in the UK. My books are in bookshops. My books are on Amazon. My books are on my website. My books are on Kindle. You know, my publishers pay me to publish, not the other way around. So, and I know because there's an awful lot of people out there who publish books because they self-publish. I don't. And this is why my books are where they are. So you don't need to just go onto Amazon to get my books. Please order them from your bookshop. Order them from your library. In fact, it's really great. I need more of my books in libraries, and they are in libraries across the UK, and there's some over in the States as well. But effectively, my books need to be out there. I'm not doing this to earn a great deal of money because you don't. You earn diddly squat as a writer these days. You do it because you're trying to get ideas out there. You know, and I'm far too old now to ever think I'm going to make anything great out of this. In fact, you know, I did a calculation as to how much I've lost over the years in terms of finance, but that's not why I do it. I do it because these ideas have got to be got out there.
Well, you're reaching people's minds, and that's what's more important than money, in my opinion. I mean, your specific position here on the planet and releasing this material is allowing people to wake up and get out of their box. So certainly you're not going to get rich for that. I mean, here at the Leak Project, I get all sorts of trolls that say, oh, you come up with these videos and you're making all sorts of money. Well, I haven't bought any mega yachts yet, certainly haven't bought a Bugatti. I'm just like everybody else, and I'm just doing my best to wake people up. So, you know, this has been a pleasure, Anthony. I certainly can't wait to speak with you again. Folks, make sure to check out Anthony's website, anthonypeake.com. Be safe and be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. Tonight, we have guest Anthony Peake. This guy is just a bounty of knowledge. He's written over 8 books, and we're going to discuss his most recent work called The Immortal Mind. He's also the author of Is There Life After Death?, The Daemon, The Gnostic Four, A Life of Philip K. Dick, and The Out of Body Experience. Now, Anthony grew up outside of Liverpool, England, and was educated at Warwick University and the London School of Economics. He is also a member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Scientific Medical Network, and Society for Psychic Research. Anthony, it's a pleasure to have you on the show here with us at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
I'm really well. How are you then?
I'm doing very good. I've been following your work now for over 5 years. I know we talked a little bit before the show. I had a chance to speak with you several years ago, and we talked a lot about the holographic universe theory, the simulation possibilities. And it just seems like every time you come out with a new book, there's just a blockbuster amount of information that's cutting edge. So what I was hoping you could do real quick, because I know we've only got an hour here today, is give our audience just a real brief description about yourself and why you decided to start writing about the out-of-body experiences and mind being bigger than just the brain.
Sure. Unlike many people who write in this area, I'm not an experiencer. I have had occasional, what I would call time slips, I suppose, for want of a better term. I've also experienced precognitive deja vu sensations in the past, but I'm not somebody that's actually had anything that you would say was really incredibly strange. My interest has always been trying to understand these experiences, trying to explain why it is when somebody claims they've had an out-of-the-body experience that they sense that they're floating above their body. Is it neurological? Or what is the explanation for it? So my approach has always been do the science first, do the neurology first, do the quantum physics first, and then take it from there. And then if things make sense, then we have a potential answer to a lot of the mysteries of consciousness itself. And indeed, my main area of focus over the years has always been what exactly is consciousness? And when we say that we're perceiving an external world, what exactly is that external world? And to what extent can we know that that external world is real? And my latest work, particularly, I know you had Jim Elvidge on recently, and my approach is very, very similar to Jim in the idea of it being some form of hologram. And it is either a brain-generated hologram or consciousness is in a field all around us. My first book is The Life After Death, The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, very much based itself upon an explanation of the near-death experience. I then moved on to explaining duality of consciousness in my book, The Daemon. Then it was the out-of-body experience, where I approached the out-of-body experience as an issue. And you're probably around about 3 books behind, because The Immortal Mind was written a few years ago now with Professor Irvin Laszlo, which was an analysis of whether we can prove scientifically that consciousness is external to the brain. But I've also written a book called The Infinite Minefield, which discusses the role of dimethyltryptamine in terms of consciousness, the pineal gland, how the pineal gland may actually modulate reality. And indeed, what I'd like to talk about today as well is my upcoming book, which is due out in the States and in the UK in September, which is called Opening the Doors of Perception, which is an updating of the 1954 Aldous Huxley book, The Doors of Perception. So that's a very quick run through my background and what bees are in my bonnet, as it were.
Oh, that's fantastic. And for those that have had an out-of-body experience, I actually had one several years ago, not intentional. I was falling asleep and I popped out of my body. It scared me so bad that I woke myself back up, and then I did it again. And then after that, I started to research it and study it and actually learn how to do it at a conscious level. I can't do it every time, but sometimes if I spend enough time and I'm sleepy enough, about ready to go to sleep, but I can keep my mind awake, I'm able to do that. But what does that actually mean? I mean, what is an out-of-body experience? Because it feels like you're actually leaving your body, but are you?
Well, this is one of the areas that's fascinated me for a long time. In my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, I very much was of the opinion that it's an external experience. You feel that you're outside of your body, whereas in fact, you've never actually left your brain. You've never left your consciousness. But what you're doing, you're in what's called a REM intrusion state, which is effectively when you think you are awake when in fact you're asleep. And you are existing within a brain-generated image of what you remember your bedroom to look like, or indeed your general environment. And you then move within that environment as if it's real. Now, there is another phenomenon that's allied to this called sleep paralysis. And again, sleep paralysis has been it's been mentioned for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, there's a very famous painting by the Anglo-Swiss painter Henry Fuseli called Nightmare. And you probably know the picture. It's a lady lying on a bed with a creature sitting on her chest.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, the in-joke of the painting is that if you look into the corner of the room, there is a window, and there's a white horse poking its head through the door or through the window, and that's the nightmare. Now, what they're describing there is something that has been reported for centuries. You know, it is this thing whereby you feel that you cannot move. It feels like you're trapped inside your body, and you can't communicate. Now, neurologically, what seems to be happening here is that when we are asleep in a sleep state, there are certain neurotransmitters that are released in the brain that actually stops the body thrashing around. It's a way of protecting us from damaging ourselves, because there is an instinct when you're dreaming to reenact what's happening in your dream in reality. So effectively, if you feel that you're fighting off a monster or something, you're going to thrash out with your arms and with your legs. And you could damage yourself, or you could damage somebody sleeping with you. So what tends to happen is the body releases a chemical which effectively stops you moving. Now, if you happen to become semi-conscious in this state, you will feel like you can't move, because literally you can't. And you will have a sensation of being pressed down by something. Now, this, of course, is the old idea of the incubus and the succubus as well. It's the idea that something is pressing on you. Now, when you're in this state as well, there is something called a hag phenomenon, and this is where you will see in the room or somewhere around you a hooded, cowled figure. Now, again, it's regularly reported, and indeed this has been reproduced experimentally by a guy called Michael Persinger at the Laurentian University in Sudbury in Canada, where he has been stimulating the brain using ultrasound. And in doing so, he can bring about these experiences of what he calls the sensed presence. Now, that explains a certain amount, but it doesn't explain the out-of-body experience, the sensation of floating above the body. Now, I still believe that when you go into these out-of-body states, you are in a form of dream, but it doesn't mean it's not real, if that makes sense. In other words, I call it the intrasomatic experience, in the sense that you are you're not outside of your body, but you are still experiencing another reality that is not this one. The reason I say this is that there is very rare examples of individuals who can bring back information when they've been in the out-of-body experience state. There are people who claim they do, and over the years there are people who claim they can distance view, there are people